Hi, this is Paul. What's coming is the unedited version of my conversation with John Vervaeke. Now, for many who've been at this channel a long time, you'll notice that the editing is sort of a new thing. I'm going to do a separate video talking about Descript, this video editing by script thing that I'm playing with. I don't know if I'll put that on the whole channel, if I just stick that in the membership section. I don't know. It might be just a little too inside baseball. If you have a reaction to that, just leave the comment below. But I just wanted to give a sense for what the editing actually is, because in this conversation, there's no real difference in the meat of the conversation. So here are the two videos. This is the video that's in the membership section. And I'm going to leave it in the membership section with no ads. And we'll see. This is sort of an experiment. I'm going to also want to do another video on YouTube and advertising, because there's been some significant developments in that are happening with respect to the premium system. YouTube doesn't advertise this, but some other channels on YouTube are talking about it. And so part of my experiment is to see, especially in the membership section, how long I can have ads that are not, or have videos that are not monetized. Because what happens is that if a video gets enough views, YouTube will start to monetize it and put ads in anyway. David Fuller, when he was doing Rebel Wisdom, would try to keep the ads out of the interstitial ads out of his videos, and YouTube would keep putting them in, and David would keep taking them out. So I'm not going to play that kind of whack-a-mole with 2,500 videos. So here is the unedited beginning of this conversation. Hi, this is Paul, and pretty much once I get my sound settings correct. Okay, let's start that again. Hi, this is Paul, and pretty much everybody here will recognize this guy. And John and I were just chatting a little bit, and maybe we should start with the strangeness, the strange turns that our lives have taken on social media. I looked
Yeah.
it up, and I think our first conversation was around 4 years ago, and
Wow.
yeah, which is which gets me thinking about. I was just also telling John. Notice all of the unfinished sentences. If you think that drives you crazy, you should talk to my wife, because this is how I am. I don't stutter, but I have unfinished sentence stutter, which is something you have to keep working on. So what I do with the script is I sort of clean it up, and so that is the unedited version, and this is the edited version. Was around 4. Hi, this is Paul, and pretty much everybody here will recognize this guy. Maybe we should start with the strangeness, the strange turns that our lives have taken on social media. So what took 14 seconds in the edited version took, oh, what, 34 seconds. So I cut out 20 seconds of me fumbling over words. And I didn't do that throughout the entire video. John does some of the same things that I do. No, 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 I. It's just sort of natural speech. And there's actually a fair amount of theory about speech in terms of how this impacts us. But that's the difference between these two versions of the video. What I also did in the membership section is no wait, no ads. Everything that's on no wait, no ads will come to the full open channel. Not everything in the membership section will come to the full open channel. But what I did was I took the unedited version out of no wait, no ads, and I put it into the whole membership channel, and it's demonetized. So again, we'll see how long YouTube doesn't put ads on there. I think for a lot of the things behind the membership wall, they probably won't, because those videos are a lot less, are viewed quite a bit less than the others. Now, again, I'm going to do another video on Descript and some of the process that goes into this. I have not by any means done that to all of the videos for reasons that I'll talk about in that other video, but what comes after this is the unedited version of my conversation with John Vervaeke. So I hope you find it helpful. Hi, this is Paul, and pretty much everybody here will recognize this guy. And John and I were just chatting a little bit, and maybe we should start with the strangeness, the strange turns that our lives have taken on social media. I looked
Yeah.
it up, and I think our first conversation was around 4 years ago, and
Wow.
yeah, yeah, which is which gets me thinking about I was just also telling John, in my little corner of the corner, there's been drama recently, and I think John Van Donk nailed it right in terms of a define the relationship moment for a lot of people. We're talking to these random people online. We're building relationships. I remember I had been dating my wife for a couple of months, and I got to a point, and I had to define the relationship conversation with her. What are we having? Where are we going? And that's kind of a so
Mm.
John, let's start with you because you, of course, before YouTube, I remember the uh, Buddhism and cognitive science recordings
Yeah.
where the sound
Yeah.
was terrible, and
Yeah.
but before your own sort of rise on YouTube, you were embedded in a university.
Yes.
You were a favored professor. You had you had a degree of academic success, and I'd say success as a university professor. Now, 4 years into this social media thing, what have you learned and what has been instrumental in terms of making some of the decisions that you've made?
Um, I there's things I don't know if I guess I learned them, but I'd sort of set myself to them. I set myself from the very beginning when I entered this that I would always keep one foot firmly planted in the science, um, because I think I've watched people here get disconnected from the community that can correct them, and I think that's problematic. And so, interestingly enough, I was wondering what would happen if uh, my online, I don't know what to call it, career took off, how that would interact with my academic career. And to my surprise, it has quite significantly increased my academic career. The number of publications, the number of collaborations I've been doing, quantity and quality has gone up significantly. Uh, and even last year, the University of Toronto formally acknowledged in my, we get a yearly review, merit review and stuff like that, that my online work was good and significant and valuable. Well, they were watching to see if I would go the way some other people who rose in social media would go. And when it became clear I wasn't trying to attack or abandon my academic home, things go well. I'm the director now of the cognitive science program, and sounds like they want me to do that again. And but although that's not yet official, um, so and that has been a that has been a welcome surprise because I wanted that, and it turned out that wasn't an unrealistic hope. It turns out that that is doable. And so I'm offering, I suppose, myself as evidence that it is possible to pursue an online presence, career, whatever. We don't quite have the right word for it, while maintaining a proper connection to another world, a scientific world, a world that is more oriented towards truth seeking than fame seeking, if I can put it that way. Although, of course, the academic world is also beset by its own sort of petty fame seeking. It was good, by the way, to be out of that into a wider arena of that, because when you're back inside the politics, if all you see is the politics, it can wear on you, right? But because I get to see this wider arena that has tsunamis as
Mhm.
opposed to the ripples that, right? And so I have a much more a humorous relationship to the politics, and the climbing that's going on within the academic world, and not to be too self-righteous. It's also because I know there's a certain amount of liberation. I mean, I could shut down my entire academic career and make a living now elsewise, right? And so, to be fair and honest, that also gives me a certain amount of liberty. I'm doing it now more because I want to than because I have to, and that changes your whole stance. So that's just been a big. I'd hoped for that. I had worked towards that, and it came to fruition in a way that I think is very helpful. Um, and then something else. Very early on, I just for initially practical reasons, I set up a not-for-profit, the Vervaeke Foundation. It was just largely so the money that was getting coming to me, I could put it aside without having to pay income tax. I would only have to pay non-for-profit tax, which in Canada, I imagine the United States is the same, is much, much smaller. That way I was able to accrue enough funds for after Socrates and things like that. But then what happened is kind of a godsend. Um, Ryan Barton came to me and said, your work saved my life, transformed my relationship, helped save my marriage. He was saying all these things. I can't, I know I'm remembering his words verbatim. I'm just trying to convey the spirit. He was extremely grateful. Um, and we can talk about trying to manage that in a bit. But he said, I want to help. And what I do is I build organizations. My business is a business that builds organizations. I want to build your Vervaeke Foundation into a real organization. And so he actually came to Toronto. He lives in the United States. I forget where. I think it's near Carolina, North Carolina, I think. He knew Duke. When I went to Duke and I came back with the Duke hat, he said, "Oh yeah, he knew that." Um, so he came up here. We sat in a hotel room, like a conference room, for 6 hours, and we banged it out. And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I don't want to be Aragorn. I want to be Gandalf."
Hmm.
And he said, "Right." And I said, I want to build this organization not just to grow, but to more importantly grow virtuously and grow with virtuosity. And and I won't. Nobody will be allowed into the to this who does not explicitly and after being vetted commit to that. And so he started building this, and he started building. And now the Vervaeke Foundation, I mean, Chris now works for it full time. He's the executive director, Christopher Master Pietro. Tyler Barrett is on as, permanent part time as our director of programs. He's helped build up an entire platform, Awaken to Meaning, where people can go and they can drop in with Rick Ripetti and do meditation. They can do the dialectic into Dialogos intensive. Like we've got all this, all the offerings are there. He's running all of that. Uh, we have Ethan Say, who is he's in charge of Patreon and also helping out with so much. He's also full. He's permanently full time, part time, um, and then we also have an ongoing contract, very close relationship with Eric uh, uh, Foster from Upfire. Um, and so what's happening is um, it's I mean, unless you're psychotic or raving narcissist, you actually some part of you wants this and you don't even realize it. It's grown beyond my grasp.
Yeah.
And that's very hard for an academic because we are used to micromanaging every aspect of our work. And it's grown beyond my grasp. And because these are beautiful people that I are worthy of trust, it has grown and there's projects going. So I retain absolute veto rights over everything, but there's many projects that I'm supervising them and to some degree inspiring them from like 30,000 feet. I'm not down here, and it um so that's been like amazing. And what's happened is because there's beyond the mandate of building up an organization that's in service to others, I have made it a continual that these people are supposed to help keep me at arm's length from the money and the reputation. We're supposed to share credit. They're supposed to watch, right? And that's been tremendously helpful for me. Um, so I've learned, I'd hoped, sorry, this is all very optimistic, which is unusual for me. I'd hoped that to build something like that, that would both have an outward and inward facing of virtue and virtuosity. And lo and behold, that seems to be the case. And so that has protected me to, I mean, not only do they take a lot of load off my plate, and they do it with grace, right? Um, they also just, I don't know what to say. they protect me from myself.
Mm.
And they're not to the degree you and I were talking before off camera, but not to the degree that Sarah does. But they reliably bring out the better in me, and they have, and lovingly so. And I don't know. I just, yeah, I'm grateful. They bring out the best in me, and they've committed themselves to that. And so I've learned that a couple of things that I hoped would work do work and seem to be helping and making a difference. Um, and that's also helped with the negative side, the exposure. That's been mitigated by this. Um, they've all met Sarah. They came here a few weeks ago in Toronto. We stayed at her place. They're deeply supportive of my relationship to her, to my kids. Um, uh, I feel very privileged, in the good sense of the word, not in the woke sense. I feel very privileged. I feel, um, like I said, it's not completely luck. I tried to bring this about, but it has exceeded my expectations and my fears. Um, and so that's been good. Still dealing with the parasociality. It happens more frequently, especially at the university. Some students come to the university because I'm there, and nothing creepy. Well, one or two creepy. I get creepy emails from people who are carrying on long conversations with me. I'm not replying or acknowledging their email, but they somehow think I'm answering them, and but that not too many.
You're answering them in your videos.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's that, and but when I meet them face to face, and Sarah was very helpful about that, because initially my response when people would come up, because of my concerns and because also the social phobia, I would try and put push people away and
Yeah,
get away as soon as possible. And she said, she didn't use this words, but this is how it sort of came out. It's like, John, you're all about religio and connectedness. This is a moment of deep connection for these people, and you're
yeah,
denying it to them. You shouldn't be doing that. You're
yeah,
you're not practicing what you preach.
yeah,
And I went, oh, you're right. And she said, I get your concern. You don't want to be consumptive of this. So she said, act as if somebody came up and you and them played some beautiful music together and you enjoyed it together. And then it was done and the music was over and they leave. And I went, okay. And I've been trying to put that into practice, and that has been extremely helpful. It gives people, sorry, even saying this sounds wrong, but it gives people their moment.
hmm
That sounds, but nevertheless, it gives people their moment. And yet, but it's a framing that prevents me from like, oh, because
yeah,
everybody has that. And if somebody says they don't have that, I don't believe them.
yeah,
There's a part of you, there's that primate part that goes, whoa, ooh, isn't that tasty? Um, and you gotta just, like, if you fight it, well, it's like in meditation. You don't fight, you don't feed your monkey mind. You just, oh, there it is.
yeah.
It's over there. Right. And it just jumps and then fades, and you try to stay with that. And so that's been interesting. Um, and then one more thing, and I don't talk about this with everybody. I talk about this a lot with the Vervaeke Foundation people, and they've been very supportive of it. Um, but this next series that I'm working on, this is going to be unlike anything I've done before. Um, So I'm going to ask in friendship that you allow me some language that might be a little bit overblown, and I understand it is, but I'm trying to use it because I don't really know the language to use. I'm going through some process of preparation, purification. Again, I don't know. It's calling me much deeper than just the way I've prepared for a course. This is a much more profound, and the because I'm going to be going to these locations and being there, and right and right. I'm talking about the philosophical Silk Road. It has, and again, I don't, I'm not intending to be sacrilegious, but it's taking on, and the closest word I can come to this, it's like a pilgrimage for me. That's the language that's coming to mind for me. And I don't mean to be anything, and I'm not trying to be insulting. You know that. You know that. I'm not. I'm just trying to. This is how it's unfolding for me, and And so this is having, and I mean, I keep doing all my work. In fact, I'm publishing more than I ever have, and really, I think some of my best work, a lot of people are thinking is happening right now, which is I'm just happy about that. But the amount of work I'm putting in every day towards this other project is already, and then, and then I'll have the summer, and then I have sabbatical, and so it's not obsession. I've had an obsession before. That's not the right word. Um, so that's also been happening very significantly, and part of it is I feel called to try and use this medium in a very different way. This is I'm trying to create a new genre. Well, me and the foundation, like this is going to be presented at multiple levels. See how this is how you've affected me, Paul. So at the right, there'll be the meso level, the in-between level, and it'll be like a series, kind of like after combining aspects of After Socrates and Awakening, but also on location, and there'll be music and animation, and I might even talk, like if I'm thinking about Whitehead, I might talk to an animated form of Whitehead and all that sort of stuff, and but also going through it and the geo philosophy and the atmosphere and the music, and also me just undergoing it. I'm going to try and walk a significant, amount when I go to these various places, and then Chris will be there at various times, and he'll be sort of like a father confessor. What's happening to you, John, in this, right? So and that'll be the meso level. And then if I start talking about things, instead of always trying to present the full complex academic argument, I'll do it much more gesturally at this level. But then I'm going to make a whole bunch of more academic video essays for all of these topics, and you can drill down, and then you can drill down beneath them, and there'll be all this literature. And right now, the we have our volunteers. We have a volunteer organization for uh, the Vervaeke Foundation called the Codex, and they're building from like somebody in grade 10 to high school, undergrad, graduate, right? Multiple levels of access to all of my information, kind of like an extended multi-level glossary. And that will be down there at that. And that'll sort of, every level will have sort of a level you can access the material at. So there's this micro level, there's a meso level, and then at the top we're going to try and extract and do extra filming and draw like together like just a 2 hour kind of movie documentary that has much more narrative structure to it to give people who just want that. And the idea is people will be able to move through this um, as they wish, multiple levels of access, um, multiple contacts to different kinds of people at every level. Um, and so um, part of it is not only um, not only is this as a pilgrimage, it's I feel a tremendous responsibility because you and I'm sorry, I'm talking a long time, but this was a deep question. You and I have both been wrestling with the ambivalence of this medium, of these media, right? I will now not, I will not use Twitter for anything other than thanking people and making announcements, right? I refuse. I refuse. And people try to call me out into political stuff. There's no point. There is no point. There, this you're acting, you're pretending like we could have a reasonable conversation about this, and that is impossible in this medium. So
Yeah,
I just refuse.
yeah,
So I'm trying to see if it's possible to that the hyper technology that's now available in these media to deal with the access problem at multiple levels and see what kind of social dynamical system grows by offering something at a multi-level ongoing way. And of course, it'll keep running. The bottom level will keep being added to, will be living. And that's the intent. Now, the final thing, which will probably maybe perhaps strike you as sacrilegious, but that all of that is because, and this came up in the conversation. You might have, I know you saw it with Daniel Schmachtenberger,
yeah,
McGilchrist. It's come up in many
yeah,
conversations. I talked about this with Jordan Peterson.
yeah.
I think there's an advent of the sacred happening right now, and the point of this, in response to the meaning crisis, and the point of the philosophical Silk Road is to put myself in service to this. I am not trying to found a religion, and thank you for reminding people that I'm not doing that. but I do want to put myself in service of it, be an embodied vehicle, try to just give people something by which they can participate with. What would that look like to try and enter into a relationship with that? And that's what I'm trying to do. And I think, right, nobody lives on the Silk Road. Everybody should go back to their home where there's the much detailed, thick description of the sacred. But the Silk Road should have a thinner. I'm using what's his name? Schellenberg in his book, when he talks about thick and thin and strong and weak. Um, the Silk Road should be thin, is it should go for what is most shareable, but it should nevertheless strong, be oriented towards real transcendence, ultimacy, right? Um, and that way everybody can travel on the Silk Road and return to their homes, or maybe move to a different home, right? And that's the intent. Sorry, that was a long answer, I'm sorry. You are more than just somebody I'm talking to, and so much more came out.
Well, no, John, and I, we're here to listen to you, and but it's interesting some of the ways in which your Silk Road reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with this image from C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, where he talks about, so of course Lewis comes into, he was raised in Belfast. Lewis is Irish, Northern Ireland,
Yes.
and he's raised in Belfast with obviously this deep tension between the Protestant Catholic tension. And of course his mother dies when he's 6 years old, and his father is just completely unprepared how to. The mother was the emotional center of the
Right.
home. Father doesn't know how to handle these boys. Lewis, throws away religion. Um, as a young man, very common story. Of course, goes off to the First World War, has exactly the right kind of wound to save him, so he has to sit out most of the war with his injury. Um, has is educated by a hard bitten Scottish atheist, um, and then of course in at Oxford via Tolkien and Dyson and others embraces Christianity, embraces the mythos, and sees Christianity as the true myth. But then, of course, he's going to have to deal with the the ongoing civil war within Christianity that the West had been fighting, forever. And so then comes up, reappropriates a term, mere Christianity, and tries to, during World War II in England, tries to present that to a radio audience. And I think there's, because in many ways, who would have thought everything of C.S. Lewis, who would have thought he would be a hit on the radio? Um, and then also, I mean, Lewis was a very strange man in many ways. He never learned to drive. Um, he had there are many questions about his sex life prior to his late in life marriage to Joy Davidman.
Yeah.
There's a ton of stuff there, but he puts on the front burner of the church this image of mere Christianity, and he basically used a very similar image to what you did of the Silk Road.
Mm.
That he said, I want to present you mere Christianity, which is the hallway, and off of the hallway are rooms. You don't live in the hallway.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm going to get this book. Wow. It, okay. I didn't know that. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry for interrupting. It's just my enthusiasm. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and well, when you were talking about it, it really struck me the similarity, because he said, in the rooms, of course, this is Lewis, Lewis over at Oxford, there are fireplaces and there are pints and there are
Yeah.
pipes and
Yeah.
there are warm conversations in the room, and that's where the Catholics and the Protestants and all the different kinds of Protestants. That's where you go to. You live in the room. You don't live in the hallway. So,
But you need the hallway or you won't meet other people, right?
well, that's
That's his
right.
point. That's his
Well,
point. I get it. Yeah, yeah.
well, and one of the big, when I looked at your conversation you just had with Jordan, I just want to make a point about Jordan too, just briefly in terms of the religio point that you made and the attention economy. So of course, for most of us, just watching Jordan via this strange medium that we've been sharing, as you well learn once you indulge in this medium, that people screens screens are not just for receiving; they're very much also for projection, and you learn
Yeah.
that.
Rorschach like projections for sure. Yeah.
Yes. But one of the things that Jordan, I've never seen anyone do the way he does, is these little meet and greets after his talks. And you've probably, because when I first time Jordan had one of these things in Sacramento, somebody who'd been coming to my meetup said, "Oh, I want you to meet Jordan." So they paid for my higher price ticket to do the meet and greet. And I did that actually with another friend from the meetup. And I, as a minister, often in our tradition, after you preach the sermon, you stand at the exit door of the church and you shake people's hands. And so people have heard your sermon, especially if you're a guest preacher. You don't know any of these people, and you just have like a 5-second interchange.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Yeah.
people pause and they might have a little bit of feedback for your sermon or something like that. And so Jordan has this line that people have paid like $150 for 45 seconds with him or something. And I went into that with deep cynicism.
No doubt. No doubt.
But one of the things, and myself and another friend of mine who teaches psychology at a local junior college here, I have never seen anybody work a line like Jordan, because he can, in that 45 seconds, he has this real strange way of making you feel like you're the only person in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. That was said of Socrates. They like
Yeah.
to
It,
always.
it's a it's I had never seen, and my friend who was also watching, I had never seen anybody work a line, and it's 150 people. I'm just thinking, but anyway,
The man.
to Sarah's point,
The man
that's
is
a
gifted. The
that's
man is
a
gifted.
gift and that's a skill
Yeah.
too, because and again, part of what this strange medium does is just sort of explode your Dunbar number,
It does.
because the
It
people are
does.
projecting on you, and some of the blessings that they are receiving through the screen, you have to have the projection going in order for that healing to take place
Yeah. That moment.
at that moment. And so this ability to um and you deal with this as a minister too, because what happens is, I'm sure you have this as university professor, student comes into the classroom, and you wouldn't be the professor that you are if your lectures didn't have a valence beyond, "Oh, I'm just here to get the grade."
And you have to, right? If you want to get them to consider the possibility of an education beyond an instrumental attitude, you have to have an aspect of charismatic, for lack of a better word, performance in what you're doing, sincere, authentic,
Yeah.
no pretense. But yeah, I agree.
And so, I mean, part of the trick as a pastor, what you do is, let's say someone comes into the church, and in a Protestant church, I think it's more difficult, because I would imagine in a more sacramental church, the focus is on the Eucharist, or the focus is on the liturgy.
Yeah,
In a
yeah,
Protestant church, the focus is on the sermon, and you are the preacher of the sermon. And so
yeah.
people immediately sort of first come to you and think, "Oh, here is my guru."
Uh, I've been the spark that how Protestant this medium is,
Yes.
right? It's like at the center is the guy, usually the guy for all the
Yep.
problems associated with that, usually the guy talking, and yeah, yeah, just we don't even realize that, right?
No.
How much it's insinuated into the medium. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, but then you have, as being the guy, and if you actually care about the people out there, now suddenly there is a weight of responsibility.
Yeah.
And like Sarah said, you can't just push them back.
No.
That's not, there's an asymmetry here that you certainly feel that they might not feel.
They sort
But
of know it. Many of them will come up and say they'll sort of do some framing where they will acknowledge the asymmetry, but then they'll nevertheless enact the moment.
right. And they can't help it. And it isn't necessarily inappropriate because
No, I don't think it is.
no, it bears witness to a transformation. It bears witness to something that also needs to be somehow there has to be a space, there has to be something where that can be, because that's immediately what I saw with Jordan when I saw what was happening around him at first, was that I thought that on one hand, this is an amazing thing because people are clearly being transformed all over the place, but they need a place to go because
Mhm.
Jordan can't do that for them.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
they need, this is, I think, part of why, I mean, Jonathan and I have been very much, go to church, because
Yeah.
if something has happened, you can't live on the Silk Road, you can't live in the hallway, you need to find a room, and that room has to somehow be connected, because the other people in that room need, there's going to be others that have had not exactly the same thing, but an analogous thing, a thing that, and there's going to need to be some kind of community.
I agree.
And it's something that I did this German event with Thomas Steininger, who has very much followed your work.
Yeah, Thomas and I are going to do a series together on Fuller's book, Neoplatonism, Heidegger, and the History of Being, Relation as Ontological Ground. Yeah.
And he mentioned something that you had mentioned before, and it's so funny how you hear these things, and it isn't until you hear something a number of times that it sort of
Yeah.
gets through my thick skull. But
Every
this Buddhist idea, and I don't say the word right, but somehow the Sangha is the guru is this. What is that phrase? The basically the idea that the next guru or the next enlightened one will be the community.
Oh, Thich Nhat Hanh. The next Buddha is the Sangha.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, I
And
quote that a lot.
well, and I think about that in this case because we we Buddhas on the screen here
Yes. Yeah.
are insufficient, and the well, the arena that these screens create, there has to be something, there has to be a
I agree.
community, an
You have to be ve-
ecclesia.
you have to be very careful about that. Ecclesia. So we are even very careful on Awaken to Meaning. We do not claim to be building a community. We say we are a dojo where people come and practice, and
Yeah.
they may form communities out of this, or maybe they will go back to a community they already exist in. We're not. I'm very aware of that point you're making,
Yeah.
and we cannot take on the deep responsibility that you, for example, take on in being a pastor for a church. We don't have anybody who has either the training or the time and probably the talent to do that kind of community building. So we do not pretend to be doing that. And we make a very clear message to people. This is dojo. Sometimes communities form around a dojo, but typically a dojo's got a different feel to it,
Hmm.
right? You know what a dojo is? It's like
Yeah.
a, yeah, right. And so that's what we're offering, and we make a very clear distinction. And and we welcome people to form communities or belong to their communities or what, but we're very careful to not offer that. Just like we're on the that's the I'm thinking of Tillich's tonos, the between participation and individuation. And on the individuation side, we make it very clear that we are not offering therapy. We have already a bank of uh, you know, properly accredited clinical psychologists, therapists who will be there if therapeutic needs arise, and then we will refer you to them. But we will not offer therapy, and we are not your community. We are a place, right, where you come and do this practice because we do not have the time, talent, right, or training to do either one of these things. And so we try to be very, very clear
Yeah.
with people about that, because that also because people not only project onto individuals, the Buddhas, they also project onto places, even virtual places,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And you have to be really, really careful about that. So we are trying to be very responsible to that responsibility, and delineate it very clearly. And this also helps to prevent that weird and often toxic bleed between the person and the place and the projections that often spins people out in a lot of ways. So we're trying to be very, very careful about that. Take that point you've made. I'm just
Mhm.
indicating I think that's an important point, and we're trying to take it. We're trying to respond to it with we hope very careful discernment.
I think that raises the crisis of domicide in our world
Yes.
because churches, um, it's no secret that in many places, well, at least in the West particularly, and more so in Canada than the United States, um, I mean, churches are struggling and closing,
Yep.
um, and
But nothing is replacing them. That's the
exact
problem.
that's exactly right. And so this and even therapy, um,
Therapy
is
isn't fellowship. Sorry,
exactly.
that's a slogan, right? Therapy isn't fellowship, right? That's not, and friendship, for all of its goodness, is not fellowship, right? I've been trying to make this point, and again, because of, like, the domicide you're talking about, right? And also the just the the loneliness epidemic, all of these we're losing, right? We're losing the nuance. We're losing the ability to appropriately distinguish between these things, and therefore appropriately pursue them. And this comes out in the parasocial relationships with people, that because of this kind of thing. Sorry, I just wanted to
No,
interject.
no, no, but that's and so I as a pastor, and one of the things that I'll often remind people are the differences between, let's say, a pastor and a therapist.
Yes.
With a therapist, usually you go into this um, generic office room in a strip mall,
Yeah, yeah.
and you sit in a little box, and the therapist has, by design, probably no relationship with anybody you are in relationship with.
In fact, they're usually not allowed to treat you if they do.
Exactly. And so there's a reason and a purpose, and a good reason and purpose for this isolation. But a
Yeah.
pastor is a very different thing,
Yes.
because a pastor is intentionally in relationship with many of the people you are in relationship with.
Yep.
And so, one of the things when many clergy go through seminary, one of the things that they try to really hammer into the clergy is, you are not a therapist, because so much psychology tends to bleed into the clergy, because has so much power in the culture. And so then, I so then I look at, that's part of the reason that I've been working on estuary, because estuary for us is at least an attempt to give people a starting place at a community,
Right.
which, I know there's tension within, with my conversations with churches with respect to estuary. I always say that estuary is church adjacent,
Okay.
because,
That sounds fine to me. I
well,
mean,
it's difficult because the dynamics that will happen in estuary are similar to the dynamics that happen in church. And I've now started an estuary group actually on Sunday morning before our worship service, partly to try to help re-knit together some of the people of church, because churches, well, part of what I want to talk to you about today is fundamentalism,
yes.
because I noted in your conversation with Elizabeth Oldfield on the Sacred podcast,
What a wonderful conversation.
that was a wonderful conversation.
She's an amazing lady.
Yeah, yeah, I'm talking to her later this week, so I'm
Lucky
really
you.
looking forward to
Please say
that.
hi for me. I'd love to talk to her again.
I will. I will. I'm really I don't generally go out and ask for conversations, at least for people I don't know. But also, and a lot of people don't understand this because that's sort of the ritual of YouTube, that you have conversations with other people that other people are watching. And so you then sort of have this, you have virtual, you have on-screen one or two conversation virtual relationships with other people, and that becomes this thin facsimile for relationship that people sort of parasitically indulge in.
Yeah, the proper lines between family, friendship, and fellowship get blurred, but that also means the relationships get confused,
Yeah.
and that's very problematic. So you were mentioning something about fundamentalism.
Well, you had made a comment, and I know none of us can be held to any of the comments that we make in all of these conversations, but you had said something very tender and loving about your mother,
Yeah.
and you had mentioned fundamentalism in that context. And what that provoked for me was, I've always had a degree of, especially after 9/11, fundamentalists sort of became proxies for evil. The last thing you want to be as a fundamentalist of any stripe, and it was sort of
Right.
Islamist fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, they sort of
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
certain narrative become the evil people. And I, of course, have in a the Christian Reformed Church is sort of a tweener denomination, in that we've got some conservatives and some more progressives, and so
Hmm.
it's, in that sense, it's very much an immigrant ethnic denomination. And so I've actually thought a lot about fundamentalism, in at least in the Christian space, and how it works. And and then hearing what you said about it, I thought, fundamentalism is another aspect of domicide
Hmm. I think so.
and this meaning crisis. And now, you obviously, given your story, and there are many out there who have left. I mean, part of the decline in church in the West is a departure from fundamentalisms because of aspects of fundamentalism that really doesn't work well in a hyper pluralist world like we live in, that the internet is sort of continuing to fuel. Not only do
Yeah.
you have sort of the urban cosmopolitan experience um, that recognizes the pluralisms around us, but now via the internet,
It's
pluralism is
magnified.
just all over the place. And I almost see fundamentalisms as, getting a definition of fundamentalism isn't easy. But then also, I think, noticing the dynamic of sort of pluralistic shock, because
But
we're all raised in these little households. We're all raised in little fundamentalist enclaves. You sort of
we
have to do
were,
that in your developmental process.
we've got the first generation that has been raised completely in front of screens, and we're starting to see the effects of that. So that's
So
not,
talk to me a little bit about fundamentalism and how that,
yeah,
if you've done any thinking about how
I
that.
have, have. And yeah, I mean, and so there's two things that sort of bumbling around in me. One is um, a way in which I was able to feel genuine compassion to my mom, and that opened things up. And I was understanding how she was seeking a kind of absolute purification, and fundamentalism provided that for her. And it was her way of trying to earn back a place in the family and in the religion, and given what had happened to her and how she had been abused, um, that helped me release some, because fundamentalism and her were bound up in my mind, in that psychodynamic way that kids grow up. And so that opened things up for me. I've been thinking a lot about it, and I've been thinking a lot about it since you sent me the email. And I've been so I like I've been trying to understand this, and one way to understand it um, is perhaps, I mean, I think there's maybe three things that I don't know if they're poles, but we should talk about them and see if they hang together or not. One is a reaction to pluralism, yes, and the potential domicide that comes with it, like the Hellenistic domicide, because of its uh, the first massive pluralism epidemic, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And we, of course, now have globalization, which just and the internet, and all right. So there's definitely that. Something I think you should also mention is, and we know this at least from Christian fundamentalism, it's a response to science in a powerful way. The fundamentals were written, right? And there's a shadow relationship with science. There's a rejection of the kind of continual self-correction and instability that is a proper part of science. But there's an attraction to which I think is often a misreading, but a Cartesian interpretation of somehow certainty is provided. And so there's the longing for certainty, again, as a response to meaning crisis. And there's a weird shadow relationship with science that I think is parasitic on the shadow relationship or the sisterhood relationship you've been talking between secularism and Christianity. Um, and then there's this third thing, which comes out in particularly with respect to my mom. There's two things sort of linked here. So this is more of a psychological. Well, these are all psychological, but there's the sort of the hyper preference for the purity code. Everything there's a purity code mentality that is dominant, and this is seeking. And again, it was only in even in that conversation I was understanding why do people pursue purity codes. Well, they pursue purity codes when they are often facing the kind of bleed issues and confounding and confusing issues. They're trying to, it's a sorting strategy that is trying to reestablish fundamental boundaries, right, that are needed, in order to make sense. And things that bleed between the boundaries are properly horrifying. And I've talked about horror. And so purification strategies are often strategies of horror resistance. And I mean that in a philosophical sense. And then that's bound up with a particular envisioning, and it can go one of two ways. There's a profound nostalgia or a profound utopia. So there's fundamentalisms on the right and on the left. I reject the left move to associate fundamentalism just with the right. I think that's hypocritical, and lacking in the self-reflection and self-correction that is a proper mark of proper rationality. So, that vision, there's something about that vision, right? Um, the power of that vision sort of wants to limit interpret it the freedom of space for interpretation, right. And so authority um it becomes really central, and the point of the vision is the vision authorizes or legitimates the authority, and then the authority is often the enforcer of the purity code, and then the purity code is bound up with the attempt to get, but in a shadow way, the certainty of science, um, and and then defend against the threat of the domicide of pluralism. That's my initial take.
That sounds really helpful. And I like how I hadn't, it's funny because once you say something, it's like, oh, of course. I mean, because that is a key aspect of what we're generally pointing to, especially when we're pointing to in a negative way, fundamentalisms.
Yes,
That and the purity codes are, of course, all about boundaries.
very much. They're about boundaries, and one of the bleed problems we have um, is the bleed, and of course, You can see Jesus of Nazareth, I think, properly wrestling with this, and you can see the Stoics really wrestling with the Cynics and the Stoics, is confusing purity codes and moral codes. We need both, and
Yes.
they are superficially, they sort of can feel similar, but they're not the same, and they're not oriented. And one of the things we're wrestling with, both virtuously and viciously in our culture, is how do we properly discern the difference and properly relate purity codes and moral codes? And part of what I've come to try and get, and you just said it, and I always knew this, but I didn't know it, which is, well, there's don't just reject the fundamentalism. I will criticize it, but we're talking about, don't just do that sort of like this complete rejection. Try to understand what's the functionality at work in it. Why,
Yes.
like, how was it helping my mother while also harming her? And part of that is, well, what is the functionality of purity codes?
Yeah.
I think the attempt to, I think it's false, or maybe at least inductively. We have tried the project of, we'll just dispense with all purity codes and we'll just
Right.
all live in an enlightenment, pure, ha 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 ha, pure moral code. And we've realized, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. That doesn't work. Um, I'm not saying we should return back to confusing the two.
Yeah.
And so we wrestle with issues. Let me try and do so. I'm going to make myself vulnerable, and because I want to try and show that I'm committed to this existentially, not just intellectually. Okay, I'm going to say something, and initially might, and I ask for people to give me the patience to listen to everything I'm going to say. Okay, I don't want to see two men having sex. And there's a powerful, listen to my word, disgust reaction come up. That's a purity code thing because of the kind of identity I have and the sexual boundaries I create in order to bring an order, to my sexual life that I need. That doesn't mean I have a moral criticism. And I know you may differ with me, but I'm trying to make a point here. I'm talking from my own perspective.
Yep.
I don't confuse that with a moral criticism of homosexuality. Let me give you the exact analogy. They're both dead now, but I do not want to see my parents having sex. But I can't, on pain of self contradiction, have any moral criticism of them having sex because that's how I got here, right? Do you see what I mean? And
Yes.
you have to pull these apart, and you have to pull them apart without saying, well, what I can do, we can get rid of this. Part of the Enlightenment project was that all of this is just superstition and we can just dispense with it. And this can be just Kantian, autonomously, rationally justified, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the two problems we have is, right, we have problems of bleed and confusion. And we also have problems of exclusion as if, well, we just don't, we can live without purity codes. And part of what happened in that sort of emotional moment around my mom that I was sharing is I realized that's just pretentious on my part. I have my
Mm.
purity codes. I just gave you one. I
Yep.
just gave you one. That's why I expose myself as vulnerable. I have my purity codes. And if I try to destroy them, I will destroy myself. What I have to do is put them into proper proportion,
Yeah.
ratio. I have to put them into proper proportion and in proper relationship of discernment, but also relationship to moral codes. That's how I've been struggling with this at a more existential personal level. I hope that was helpful because and please don't jump on me for what I just said 10 minutes ago. I'm trying to make a point here.
A couple of things strike me. I mean, purity codes and the dynamics of purity are interesting in that, like so many things, you can't live without them. And because, and part, especially if you're in a, if you're dealing with religion, because religions, they
Hmm.
deal with the ultimate, and so the imagery around religions will, at least in my experience, will tend to have to trade in ultimates. And once
Hmm.
you sort of have that ultimate, there's going to be, you run the risk of a purity spiral.
But you do, and we can talk about that. But on the other end, just to
Yep.
like, so let me just. I want to. I'm trying not to be super technical, but there's modal fallacy. Modal logic deals with possibility and necessity. So what's a modal fallacy? So here's a, okay, so solid objects, solid objects. There is no particular shape a solid object has to have. Do you agree with that?
Mhm.
But I can't conclude from that that solids don't have a shape. That's a modal fallacy. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yep.
Even though you don't have to have a particular shape, that doesn't mean solids can be shapeless.
Right. Right.
You don't have to have a particular purity code because you look around at pluralism, and you're right, you don't. But that you shouldn't do the modal fallacy. That means I can live without a purity code.
Right.
You see the difference?
Yep.
That's
Yep.
the difference I'm trying to make. So
Because
go ahead. Go
no,
ahead.
no, because as you said, right and left, everyone has some purity codes. I mean,
They
you
do.
they spring up like daisies.
Oh, they're both the left and the right, especially in the United States, but it's starting to happen here in Canada. They go through purges because they're
Yes.
enforcing purity codes.
Yes. And
And
it's
they're running into, and I don't want to talk about it in depth, but part of what's happening around the rise of anti-Semitism and but supporting the Palestinians and the whole thing is a deep battle between purification codes and moral codes. And we're realizing that there's a horrible mess about this,
yeah.
a horrible mess.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna talk about the politics. I'm just pointing out that that is right, what you
Yeah.
said about left and right. And you could see it even within the left and within the right, not only between the left and the right, but also within the left
Yes.
and the right.
Yes. And it also strikes me that both in terms of, say, when I read the Bible, if you read, let's say, the Mosaic Code that you find in Exodus, and people sort of react to that sometimes. But then, so as is so often, if you read a complex text like the Bible, the closer you read it, the more you begin to see the nuances beneath it. And actually, Jesus pulls that out with, of course, you have these strange stories where David, for example, is fleeing Saul and he's hungry.
He eats the
And
showbread. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
right. And of course, Jesus pulls this out and says, what's with that?
Yeah.
Because David is not a priest. He ought not to eat the showbread, yet the priest gives him the showbread. And, David, so you've got that story, but then you've got another story in that whole matrix where the Ark of the Covenant has been used improperly by Eli's sons in battle against the Philistines as sort of a weapon. And
Yeah.
then it gets captured. And they have
Of
all
course.
this stuff going on in the Temple of Dagon. Again, these are great Bible stories for kids. They listen to these like,
Yeah.
Dagon and the statue. And then, of course, they're transporting the Ark of the Covenant back to Israel, and it's tottering.
Yeah.
And
The guy puts his hand up and he gets killed.
he
Yeah.
gets
Yeah.
killed. And so we have all of these stories. So why can David eat the showbread and not be judged? But yet the poor guy who just reached out his hand to steady the ark out of seemingly in some ways devotion to God, he certainly meant well. He pays for it with his life.
Right. And I'm not trying to put this in exactly the same category, but I go to save a child, and because of that, inadvertently, in front of a whole bunch of people, my pants fall down. I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed, regardless of the fact that, well, that's right. I was right. The purity codes have a life and power. I don't want to impose on the Bible, but part of what's that saying is like, yes, moral codes can sometimes trump purity codes, but purity codes have have a numinous power that also shouldn't be taken for granted.
Yeah.
And that means they seem to also at times challenge our moral codes.
Yeah.
And they do. And I think they have a very, I like the word you used. I think that there's a very nuanced and sort of ongoing reciprocal reconstruction relationship with them. And like I say, people will often reject a purity code. They adopt a moral code, and then they find a purity code is growing up around their new moral code. You see this when people go through religious conversion.
Yes.
You see this when people give up smoking for legitimate moral concern, like good health, right? Self-protection, right? But then they become purists and they become antagonists, right? Like all of and there's something going on there. And I think it has to do with the fact that, morality is exapted out of purity codes, which are exapted out of biological boundaries. Like we live in a continuum, and right, it's trying to exclude these from each other is a mistake, and trying to identify them with each other is a mistake. And I, I'm at times I worry that we're losing the kind of discourse that allows for the nuance that will properly proportion our attention and regard for purity codes and moral codes, and that does worry me, because that's where fundamentalisms and totalitarianisms also can start to grow together in powerful ways.
Well, and in terms of sort of the levels, I was using America's experiment of prohibition in the early part of the 20th century, which is something, it's so interesting to me. We talk about progressives now with a particular political and moral valence on different sides, of course, but the
Yep.
progressive era was actually a very long thing that involved many child labor laws, women's suffrage, and then one of the things people seldom remember is prohibition.
Prohibition. Yeah, because it doesn't
And
fit the narrative.
right, right. And and prohibition was such an interesting experiment because, if I look at if I if I watch someone who, let's say, has struggled with alcohol, and then something happens and it provokes, this time they're going to go to a 12-step program and they're really going to work the program. They're really going to take it seriously. If there's AA is an interesting example because they are fundamentalists of sorts.
Mhm.
And I remember a good friend of mine who was who had done AA years before I'd met him and kept his sobriety. Eventually he came to church because he you know, the fundamentalism of AA is that you can go into that meeting and you can tell them absolutely everything. That the one thing that they are really focusing on is, did you drink?
Yep.
They're smoking like chimneys. They're eating like
Yeah.
crazy. They might be
Yep.
cheating on their wives. It
Yep.
doesn't matter.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
and
Yep.
and so
Yep.
you see, and these things sort of level up in terms of from individuals then into communities and even into whole societies. And so, the United States of America is, to pass a constitutional amendment in the United States is a pretty difficult thing. You need a lot of agreement culture
Yeah.
wise. And within the span of about a decade, they both managed to create prohibition and take it down.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so to me, when I look at, say Islam almost died at the end of the First World War with the destruction of the caliphate.
Mhm.
That is an enormously important thing for that community where, now the end of the First World War, obviously the Ottoman Empire had been declining and failing for a long time. And then the caliphate is made illegal. What does a religion do? Talk about domicide,
Yeah. Yeah.
an entire civilization with and this happens repeatedly through history, the fall of Constantinople.
Well, not only that, when the Ottoman Empire comes, and then Ataturk, right,
Yes.
and Turkey embraces secularism, right,
Yes.
I was going to say in a fundamental way, but maybe that's the right way to say it. Yeah. So yes, you continue.
Well, and so, so we sort of run these things up into the big picture, sort of like Plato in the Republic,
Yeah.
here,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
we're going to run it up, and then we're going to run it down, and we're going to go up and down. And
Yep. Which
so
is beautiful.
and then when I think about the meaning crisis and the way that, let's say, pluralism and nihilism play together,
Hmm.
because I think one of the big drivers of the collapse of religious communities has clearly been this dynamic between pluralism and nihilism, just back and forth between each other, and then leaving people exhausted because
Yeah.
where are the boundaries? And so then the very human, let's say even a social adaptive reflex is there are no boundaries, you know,
Yeah.
and almost it can be almost an arbitrary boundary, you know, rigid boundaries,
Yes.
purity codes,
And,
and
and they're often put up with that sort of, I don't know what to call it. I don't want to be too insulting, but I need to make a distinction. Sort of a pseudo certainty. See,
yes,
Descartes confuses, as I was talking to Jordan, Descartes confuses psychological certainty with logical certainty, right? Oh, well, if you can't doubt it, then it's metaphysically necessary. No, you cannot doubt it because you're a racist. You cannot doubt it because you have a failure of imagination. You cannot doubt it because you're ignorant of these real facts that would change. Like psychological doubt does not license, right? Sorry, psychological indubitability does not license logical necessity or metaphysical necessity, and that's a problem. And what we can do is we can very much get our we can do a kind of reciprocal narrowing, especially when in the right environment, in which we can get to a place where we are. It becomes, in Frankfurt's terms, unthinkable to us. Like it's unthinkable to me that I could kick Jason out. I can logically run all the propositions, but I can't get into that identity. We can get to a place where it's we become psychologically incapable of doubting the framework because of the degree of reciprocal narrowing, doubling down, deep identification, and then that gets confused with logical metaphysical certainty. But we inherited that grammar, I think, ultimately from Descartes. Maybe it goes back earlier, probably into the late Middle Ages, but clearly that's going on in Descartes. And I think that's also how these walls go up. There's a fundamental, right? Um, there's a fundamental confusion between that psychological indubitability and a metaphysical necessity. Because you see, the second licenses you to pronounce to other people. It's like, this is the way it really is. The first doesn't. But if you
right,
confuse the two, you can get a lot of that. And so, I mean, but on the other hand, you go the other way, right? Because one of the things the interaction with the sacred does across religions, in Christ there is no Jew, there is no Gentile, right? And many, almost all of the religions say, as you approximate the ultimate, you realize those boundaries are not absolute in some important way. Um, but that doesn't mean, like, so Zen makes a distinction between absolute and relative, and Schindler does the same thing with Plato, right? It doesn't mean you come back and destroy the boundaries, right? So when I was doing Zen, rivers were rivers and mountains were mountains. While I was doing Zen, rivers weren't rivers and mountains were mountains. After I was done doing Zen, rivers were rivers and mountains were mountains, but it's different,
yeah,
right? And so, um, and part of what also needs to be acknowledged, and this is also what I sort of felt in that, I hope, recognition, appreciation of my mom, is there's a lot of things that are idiosyncratically indispensable for people. They have, in that they afford them the imaginal, they afford them imagery that allows them to adapt to a situation, uh, that has factors beyond their control and has also marked them in ways they can't fully recognize because of trauma and whatnot. And we can't just go into people with sort of moral self-righteousness and say, I'm going to take away your idiosyncratically indispensable thing that gives you imaginal access to your psyche and to the world, because I think it's not morally justified. It's like, you should make moral criticisms when people are doing immoral things. Don't go in and just rip apart their psyches without a deeper understanding of the kind of things. Again, the fact that no particular set of boundaries may be metaphysically necessary doesn't license the modal confusion that we can live without boundaries. Those don't follow, right? And I've been trying to understand, how do you do this? You don't just want to be just tolerant of anything and everything people are doing, but you do want to. Sorry, I'm rambling because I'm struggling. because you want to say, yeah, I get it. I get it. She had to adopt this purity code around her sexuality. That was right. She had an image of sexuality, and it wasn't an image she's looking at. In fact, it's very transparent to her. She's not even seeing it. She's only seeing through it. But it allows her to manage, right? Right, getting back into her extended family and dealing with the trauma. You can't just take that away from somebody unless you offer them a education in which they willingly participate for something that will replace its functionality. You can't just go in with a moral sledgehammer and say, what you're doing to me, mom, is immoral. You should stop it. It's evil. It doesn't like, but that doesn't mean you just accept it either.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm rambling because I'm struggling. I'm
Yeah.
struggling with you. You're my friend. So do you understand what I'm trying to get
Yeah.
at, though?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's very true. And that dynamic is cultural and social, and because and it's interpersonal, and it's not it's for a lot of people.
Oh, the imaginal can be shared by groups.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
believe in distributed cognition and
Yeah.
collective intelligence
Yeah. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure.
There's a guy on Twitter. He goes by my sister actually knows him, has known him for years. He goes by the term the naked pastor. I think his name is David Hayward. And yeah, because he like many people, he grew up in a fundamentalist Christian context, became clergy in a context like that, had a deconstruction. I don't know exactly the shape of his, sort of went from being an in real life pastor to an online pastor.
No,
Um, and
that'll change it.
yeah, well, yeah. Well, then if online pastor is actually a thing, which is something that I deeply wrestle with, or a thing that can be done. But had a little quote on Twitter from someone else who basically said, what deconstruction meant to me was that now when I moved, no one showed up to help me move.
Mm,
Whereas before, a dozen people showed up to help her move because,
yep. You lose fellowship.
yeah, you lose fellowship. And so again, sort of back to that fellowship question, one of the things, I think it's sort of an adaptive element to fundamentalisms. Fundamentalisms can create containers that afford fellowship. Now that becomes a very dicey proposition, because in many cases the terms of fellowship are strictly tied up with those fundamentalisms.
And authority and
Yes, and all
the
of those things
ongoing,
you put in.
yeah,
Yeah.
the authority and the pseudo certainty, and the always justifying vision that has licensed a lot of, and let's be frank, abuse
Yep.
within these contexts as well.
Yep.
But notice, let's move it to a secular context. The United States, Canada to a much lesser degree, United States, parts of Europe are wrestling with purity code versus moral code about their boundaries. Countries have to maintain their boundaries or they cease being countries. That's a purity code, right? And they just want to live because that's what countries are, right? But there's moral codes about, yeah, but those people are suffering, and if we don't let them in, they'll die. And so we're trying to say, and that's the struggle. That's a completely secular, although tremendously religiously impassioned
Yep.
debate, because
Yep.
it's like, well, we have to have a purity code about our country or our country will dissolve.
Yep.
Oh, but look at these people that are suffering, and if we don't let them in, we're immoral, and and you again. The United States always does what anywhere else in the world is wrestling with. The United States does it on meth or something. Yeah, but I'm just saying that that's a purely secular, notice what I'm doing, right? Version of exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people don't see it. That's exact. And so what and there it reminds me of Jesus' parable, where if you land on any one of the narrative poles, you've misunderstood it in some way. It's just really situating yourself in that tonos, that tension, is where you have to be, right? Or you lose your humanity in
Yeah.
in really important ways. Sorry,
Well,
I just wanted to bring that up because I think that's another version of the very, very dynamic we're talking about.
well, exactly. And so fundamentalisms arise. So one fundamentalism is build a wall. We're going to
Yes.
let no one in. I mean, Japan.
Yeah,
We're going to let
yeah,
no one,
yeah.
even if we die of childlessness here, we will let no one in.
Yes.
And the other is, no borders at all, borderlessness. And so these fundamentalisms arise. But the fundamentalisms themselves then give shape to, one of the things that I'm, now 4 years into this, I continue to ponder this, the relevance realization, how in some ways the bias, and I'm going to put this and probably hack it all up in layman's terms like I usually do with your stuff. On one hand, our biases and our filters, I mean, we
Yeah.
need
They're
these,
indispensable.
they're indispensable, and they cut both ways.
Yeah.
And you can't live with them and you can't live without them. And here we are.
The biases, which are also heuristics,
Yep.
that's why you should have to understand them. They are very much the purity code that makes the autopoiesis of cognition possible. But you have to be able to stand outside of them from a moral, meaning a normative, the true, the good, and the beautiful stance to correct. But that correction can't destroy the filters. Yeah. It always has to ameliorate them. And this, of course, is the challenge of wisdom. And our human proclivity is we want a simplistic narrative path to wisdom. Yeah. Too bad, right? Sorry, doesn't work, right? Because you can't throw away those biases. You're not functional, but you can't simply, acquiesce in them, because then you will never come to moral maturity. And I also mean epistemic moral maturity, right? Yeah. You will not be properly pursuing the true, the good, and the beautiful. And this is Hegel's point, Kant's point. This is what was right about that whole line. You are not just an animal moved by desires. You are a person motivated by commitments to normativity, commitments to the true, the good, and the beautiful. You can't abandon that without abandoning your personhood. And so we're caught between an animal that can't live without biases and personhood that demands that we, right, commit ourselves to the true, the good, and beautiful. And we can't let the moral destroy this, the purity codes of the mind, because we will destroy ourselves. But we can't let this undermine. And so this is why I love Plato. We are bound to finite transcendence. We always have to hold the two together at all times.
So talk to me about with this, because one of the things that strikes me is that the dynamic of the Silk Road, yes, or in Lewis's case, the dynamic of the hallways, is in some sense helpful in you have to afford fundamentalisms, it seems to me, because they simply will arise, but in some ways the fundamentalisms are in the rooms.
Yeah, well, fundamentalism is when you let's play with it. Let's play with it a bit. I'll propose to you that fundamentalism is when you close the door to the room because you need some privacy for some reason. Because you need to do that.
Yep.
Now, we know it's unhealthy for people to live in rooms in which the doors are never opened, but it's also unhealthy if you never get your privacy.
Yes.
And for me, right, this is why Tillich is sort of one of the people that sort of pushed me into the Silk Road, because he proposed the God beyond the God of theism, right? But this is right, the individuation participation, right? And individuation can also be for a group. It doesn't just have to be for the. So individuation and participation is a nested function. It can be between the individual and a group. It can be between this group and the larger world, etc. And yeah, there's again, people have to they have to step back into the room and look at, right, the filters, and wow, this is who we are and this is what we are, right? And then they have to step through and go out, and they have to be open to acknowledging what I think is a unavoidable historical fact. Wow, I don't usually talk that way. Judaism changes when Christianity is born. Christianity changes when Islam is born. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam change when Aristotelian science comes in. That whole changes when Newtonian science comes. You see what I'm doing here?
Yeah.
Right? The pretense that that there's right? That the advent, these advents of new ways of relationship to the sacred don't reverberate back within the homes is pretentious. That's
Yeah.
not what's happened historically.
Yeah.
That's not what happened historically.
Yeah. Well, and oh, this stuff is so
So
complicated.
what I'm hoping, sorry,
No,
I
go.
just want to make clear. I'm hoping, in answer to your question, that the Silk Road, right, will allow people when it's like Tolkien's theory of recovery. When people return back into the room and close the door as they do need to, they are nevertheless going to recover it in a way that's transformative, the way Judaism was transformed with the birth of Christianity, and Christianity was transformed with the birth of Islam.
Yeah.
That's what that's what I'm proposing.
Where does secularity fit into this mix? Because because one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is the way that secularity was a stealing of the culture all around the world. And we're starting to see this now with, of course, Modi dedicating the new temple to Ram in India, the
And
Hagia
there's a
Sophia.
backlash. Yeah, there's a backlash to secularism. Yes.
Yeah. And so, and backlashes are complex things because sometimes they can be corrections, sometimes they
Yes.
can be just reactions, and we seldom know we seldom know we seldom know for until far past our lifetimes.
Well, I want to respond because this is another tonos, another tension, and this is between two notions within sort of the philosophy of law, between substantive justice and procedural justice, right? And substantive justice is that which constitutes justice, in the sense of, that's a just thing. And so there are things we pursue as a society that we think are substantially just, like, we want to reduce suffering or something like that. Procedural justice is, yeah, but what you want is you want the processes by which you're trying to achieve your substantial gains to always be really self-correcting. And one of the things that secularity did well, to my mind, is pull those two apart and
Mm,
say, we can commit to different pursuits of substantial justice in our society, but what will hold us together is we will all prioritize over our homed pursuits of substantial justice. We will pursue a commitment to procedural justice. We will all say that you can pursue your Christianity, I can pursue what I'm doing, but if we come into conflict, we will all go to this place that allows to tell you or me how we behave
yeah,
in the public sphere, because this space is committed to procedural justice. And one of the things that a centrist is committed to is preserving the importance of procedural justice. And one of the things I'm again worried about is I see the left and the right undermining procedural justice
yeah,
because of the elevation of substantive justice. And
yeah,
so what was gained in secularity, and I think that was part of what was going on with the separation of church and state. In the church, you will pursue your substantive justice. In the state, we will have procedural justice enshrined, and we won't confuse these two together, and we'll try to demarcate and we'll try to prevent undue interference. But everybody, all the different church homes, will share the same procedural justice.
yeah,
And that held things together in a certain way. And of course, the Civil War sprung up when the commitment to procedural justice was undermined, both by the North and the South, for their respective visions of substantive justice.
yeah,
I'm not saying the Civil War shouldn't have happened, slavery was evil, but I'm saying what happens is when you lose that commitment, you open yourself up to civil war. And I think that's what's happening right now. Both the left and the right are undermining the commitment to procedural justice. Like I like I don't think free speech should be curtailed because I believe in dialectic and dialogos only under only under very extreme circumstances,
yeah,
right? People calling to violence, shouting fire in a theater, all that sort of
yeah,
stuff, right? Like where there's clear, overwhelming, massive harm. Um, and that's a commitment to procedural justice. And we are undermining that in a very significant way. For all my many disagreements with Jordan, and he's often voiced this in a way that I consider flawed, but I still admire the fact that he has been at times trying to say, if we don't have this kind of procedural justice, things will breed in the dark. And I think that's what he's pointing to. So there's a long way of saying there is something very valuable, because we've been talking about discernment. It comes to my mind that
Yep.
that's been a thread, a through line running through everything.
Yep.
There's a proper discernment between procedural and substantial justice that secularism gave us. I don't think we should ever let that go, that commitment to a wise discernment of the difference and the proper proportioning of them. And so that's a role I think secularism has for us. I don't think that means that we have, I don't think that separation of procedural and substantive justice maps on, as the Enlightenment perhaps proposed it does, the distinction between the sacred and the profane, or the numinous and the mundane. I don't think it maps on that way.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think the procedural domain was filled with all kinds of, right, sacralization.
Yeah.
Your honor, the
Yes.
podium, the
Yes.
gavel, right?
Yes.
It's filled with the sacred,
Right.
right?
Well,
But it's not. Go ahead. Go ahead.
to Washington, D.C. You're right.
Yes.
Those are temples to procedural justice.
And that's because procedural justice deserves to have a sacred pull to it as much as substantive justice does.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's interesting too how I wonder what you think about how this maps onto the struggles with science, because in many ways the scientific method was also a question of procedure.
it is. I think that's an excellent mapping, and I'm glad you do that, because that's the mapping I want. So thank you. It's like, well, science is about, there's a procedural justice for our epistemic virtue that has to be given a kind of authority for all of us. Each of us has our own commitments, our own theories that we home in on. I'm using that in a double sense. We home in on, right? But what we do is we all commit to, right, we make sacrosanct, in a very important way, this procedural justice. Now, that can be turned into an idolatry of the scientific method. There isn't such a thing. There are scientific methods, and they're in this weird family relationship with each other, if you do any history and philosophy of science. So, right, but there was exactly that. And it was like, yes, we're after truth, right? But it has to be properly justified by a process that we are trying to keep as self-correcting as it possibly can be. Now, of course, this has been undermined, and again, because the lines have blurred, there's a lot of loss of discernment. And I am particularly upset when people identify as research activists, because that is a blurring between the pursuit, as they should, of particular substantial justice. Yes, it is important that we get rid of racism. That's a substantive justice that we should pursue. Don't let that undermine the procedural justice of how we do science, in which we step aside from those commitments because we know they're biasing, and we are exposing ourselves, because we're holding it sacred, to this self-corrective process. Yes, yes.
No, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. And it's interesting to me too how when I think about modernity, how it's just very interesting how both of these things sort of emerge and came together in many ways to form the modern world.
Yes.
And how now at this point we see sort of this recession. We see this element now tried, and it's in both areas.
Well, because I mean, we had the Enlightenment was a prioritization of procedural justice over substantive justice, because
Yeah.
things had been out of whack the other way.
Yeah.
And part of what deconstructionism is doing, especially the Derridian and Foucaultian versions of it, is they have criticized how procedural justice has been used to smuggle in substantial justice projects without proper acknowledgement and recognition. And that critique needs to be taken seriously. This is one way in which I differ significantly from Jordan Peterson. I think the postmodernists, well, at least the two that I've read deeply, Derrida and Foucault, have a legitimate and profound point that needs to be acknowledged. Um, and they're also talking about purity codes and moral codes. They're not using this language, um, but that's a lot of what's going on in that critique, and that needs to be taken into account. It's like, yeah, we smuggled in the so-called procedural justice of the law to enforce segregation, right?
Yeah.
And we did it.
Yeah.
And the civil rights movement was no, 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 right? The procedural justice has to readjust because we have to acknowledge that this is wrong, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep.
You know I'm doing this. There's an opponent process relationship
Yes.
between them. And
Yes.
we're always doing an evolving optimal grip to try and find the specific sweet spot that exists at that time.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Just one last thing, and I know we're running out of time, and then I want to give you a chance if there's anything you want to bring up. But this to me, your optimal grip and sort of my concept of dead reckoning. It's very interesting how, as we go through long periods of time, I see this in individual lives in terms of when people say either reject or relinquish or get rid of a religion and adopt a new one. um how we in our in our relevance realization, because that's what we're doing, how we sort of say, oh, this grip is more optimal than the other one. I mean, it's a very, most people come at it with a very intuitive sense. They can't, you can push them on it, you can explore it with them, and usually as a
It,
pastor you
it,
might do
it,
some of that, a therapist does, but
it is. And then what happens is people confuse the language of training by which that optimal grip is trained,
hmm,
which often involves idiosyncratic, indispensable, imaginal practices with they've discovered the metaphysical necessities that explain reality. That often happens,
yeah,
and that is again problematic because it's yes, um, you do have a better optimal grip, and I want to give proper recognition. I want to put back to you that your finesse argument is an optimal grip argument.
yes, yes, very much, yes,
Right,
yes,
right, right. And then, but the thing about optimal grip, and this, and you might push back on this, is optimal grip is environmentally dependent. You can't a priori because the
right,
trade-off relationships between bias and variance, explore, exploit, cannot be decided by an a priori algorithm. They have to always be co-created with the environment, the emergence of affordances, blah, 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 lots of Vervaeke fancy words and terms, blah, 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 right? And then the point is, so within this environment, right, and this is part of how I'm wrestling with it. Let's say there are indispensable idiosyncratic imaginal practices that finesse your relationship with ultimacy. So it's not only ultimate, it's transformative, and it puts you in touch with the really real. And it does all of that and it gives you a powerful language of training. But the coach, Winkleman, that's telling the person how to run better and says, I want you to start running as if you're a jet airplane and then as if you're running up a hill, right? That's imaginal and it's indispensable, but that's not right. How you're being trained is not a good explanation of what's actually happening when you're running, right? And so a pluralism as opposed to relativism says you can have, and this is the thin but strong, there are universal principles and processes, right, between these various environmentally finessed optimal grips. And you shouldn't go in and just sabotage that and say, well, look, that doesn't, it's like, yeah, that's like saying the person, right, who's in the football arena shouldn't be using their football skills. That doesn't make any sense. Now, what you can criticize them is if they try and play their football skills in their marriage, or for me, try to take their professor or their role as a professor into their romantic relationship. That's a disaster, right? That's self-deception at the level of participatory knowing. And so the pluralism says you can always use the through line, the universal processes and principles, to tell people where they are misplacing, if you'll allow me that term. But that doesn't allow you to make the modal fallacy of saying we can eradicate all the places. Now, I know you don't fully agree with that argument, but that's the argument I'm
Yeah,
making.
no, I understand. The difficulty that we have is part of the big shift that I have seen with this little corner, with Jonathan, with Jordan, with you, is there's a weird dynamic with skepticism, in that to a certain degree skepticism is sort of a luxury belief.
Yeah, it is and it isn't. I
Yes,
mean,
exactly.
because I mean, let's remember the skepticism originally means inquiry,
Mm-hmm.
and skepticism is, I think, properly understood as as emphasizing epistemic procedural justice.
Yes.
You need to always be doing this self-correction, because now I'll sound like the Buddha with the first noble truth. There is nowhere where you are free from dukkha. There is nowhere where you are free from dukkha, right? And that's correct. But the skeptic can then conclude something like a modal fallacy. Well, what I will do is I will try and find a place where I am free from having to engage in that self-correction. I will misunderstand the self-corrective process as leading me to the place that is perfectly beyond all these doubts and concerns. And of course, that's the hallmark of that is Descartes, right? And it's like, nope, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. And that's why I like Schellenberg. His notion of evolutionary religion, when you take the big time view, is he says you become skeptical of any particular thing, but he says that opens you up to a much more proper imaginal relationship with the transcendent. Skepticism, right, just tells you to give up understanding your relationship as primarily belief centric. And you and I differ on this, but this is part of the critique. And it's much more, and to be fair, he's got a whole bunch of people. There's this huge philosophical movement of trying to understand what's called non-believing faith, where you don't try and understand faith as some kind of variation on belief. And then he says skepticism, if properly understood, breaks up. And I think that might be where procedural and substantive justice have been confused, and in fundamentalism, it breaks them up. And what that does is it allows you to explore imaginal and therefore powerful non-belief centric notions of faith. That's what he actually argues and proposes. And he says that is a skeptical attitude, in that it is an ongoing, evolving, optimal grip relationship to the sacred.
Right. And it reminds me of Lewis's point about, basically a point about deconstruction. He didn't use those terms, is that you're always employing this basically because you believe there is actually some place to get to.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and
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 Descartes
and
did.
yeah.
And so did Hume. Hume wanted to be the Newton of the psyche.
And the challenge, of course, we face is that in this world, none of us really finally get there. I mean, that then is the tension with the fundamentalisms and the purities. We we
Yeah.
don't we don't arrive here. And then the question is, do we ever?
Right. And think about that. Let's put it into proper thing. And this is the problem with the nostalgia and the utopia. We never get back, even though the Beatles made a great song. We never get back, right? And we never get to the utopia. Every time we think we're getting close, it turns into a dystopia. And that is not a coincidence.
Right. But there's a relationship yet with, I mean, one of the things that we could talk about sometime is I looked at, nostalgia for me had a very negative valence. Nostalgia, kitsch, blah 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 blah. And then Clay Rutledge. I don't know if you've looked into any of his
Yep,
work
yep,
at all.
yep.
And I thought, oh, but there again, it's sort of like fundamentalism. It's like there's a reason nostalgias hang around. They're fulfilling a function that.
And I think, and I've been doing a deep dive into Hegel with my good friend Chappie, and I think there's a reason for that. And especially the Brandom and Pinkard interpretation of Hegel, which tries to replace a lot of what has been understood as sort of arcane metaphysics with the processes of distributed cognition, both synchronically and diachronically,
Hmm.
around rationality, which is this question of how do people get the authority to make rational claims, right? Because if they are relying on arguments from authority, it doesn't work. So how does it? And part of what Hegel's argument is, Hegel is the, but the idea is we are all, think about a judge trying to make a judgment. They always are paying attention to precedent, but they're always also trying to set precedent. They are making an appeal
Hmm.
to their ancestors and they are making an appeal to their descendants. That's the diachronic, and they're also making an appeal synchronically to their community. And so nostalgia is we make an appeal to our ancestors. Utopia is we make an appeal to our descendants.
Yeah.
And then, of course, fellowship is the appeal at the synchrony. And as you may expect, while like Hegel is, he says these are always doing this with each other, right?
Hmm.
They're always playing against, and if you try and stabilize it, you will actually undermine Geist. You will actually undermine that ongoing process by which, right, the distributed cognition creates a way of life, and then the way of life collapses under its own terms of evaluation and a new way of life, et cetera, et cetera.
So is Hegel the great is was Hegel the great philosopher of opponent processing?
I think so. I think one of the things that Dan has convinced me of, and with the help of Brandom and Pinkard and Fornath and this whole revolution that's happening around Hegel, is that Hegel's dialectic is a a proper development from the Platonic dialectic. I used to
Hmm.
set them in as opposites to each other, but the Hegelian dialectic is an attempt to take the dialectic into dialogos that I explored in After Socrates and extend it to the biggest possible Geist, collective intelligence of distributed cognition, because that is the thing that best groks reality and that we should give the most authority to, while always understanding that it itself has to be open to self-correction. That's sort of the Hegelian proposal as I'm trying to understand it via uh, the ongoing deep work with my deep friend Dan Chiappi. We're writing a book together called The Being of Rationality and the Rationality of Being. And so, yeah, I think so. I think that's a proper way of understanding Hegel. Hegel is asking the question, how do you get authority for rationality without undermining the procedural justice of rationality?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, sounds fruitful. We are closing in on our hard
Yeah,
out. Anything? The Silk Road project sounds very interesting. It sounds very ambitious.
it is.
Um,
And I and so that's why there's a lot of planning with a lot of people and a lot of time and talent going into it.
Good.
It is also my attempt to exemplify how a distributed cognition has to grok a hyper object and no one individual can.
Beautiful. Maybe that's a good place to land the plane.
It is. It's been wonderful.
It's always great to talk to you, John. I'll stop the recording.